Good evening, everyone. So, as a part of the closing session, we thought we'll have a panel discussion with Vaibhav and Choudhury sir to flag some important questions that have emerged through the course of the 2 days. Um, with respect to, of course, cinema, philosophy, justice, politics, so on and so forth. So, well, yeah, I mean, without further ado, I guess I'll leave the floor open for discussion, sir, to you and Vaibhav.
Yeah, I think Vaibhav can start, responding to the films and making his observations, and I'll of course also talk and respond, but we can also open it up to the entire group, because panel discussion would mean something wider than just the two of us.
Yeah.
So that would be nice. So Vaibhav,
Yeah. So I think I'll start elsewhere, not with the film immediately, but excerpts from a text which Ritik Ghatak wrote called "The Film I Want to Make on Vietnam." Because yesterday we started with Godard's Camera Eye, and there are striking parallels between Godard's Camera Eye and this text. The text begins, for any filmmaker today, he's writing this in late 1960s, the exact date of publication of this text being 1968. For any filmmaker today, it would be a grave and sacred thought to think of making a film on Vietnam. It would be audacity and even a sin to talk about it lightly or without deep involvement or without a serious study of all the facts about Vietnam. But that is the sin I will be committing in the course of this piece. Whatever I know about Vietnam, I have gathered from the newspapers, a few pictures and features in some reviews. I have never been to Vietnam and I have never been able to feel its pulse. Still, I somehow got the impression that the event itself amounts to the turning over of a page of history. I have the feeling that Vietnam will give the course of world history a new turn. There's something else. To make a film, I have to confine myself to Calcutta or to Bengal at the most. I don't consider it a hindrance. I would rather find it promising as a precondition for creativity in the arts. For the little that I have realized about Vietnam tells me that the fight in Vietnam is being fought here. Here too. For Vietnam stands as a symbol of protest against exploitation all over the world. It would be wrong maybe to take it for a symbol. It would actually stand for the ultimate extension of that protest. All the miseries and lamentations of our country have found a magnification in the war in Vietnam. That is something that the American ruling class has never realized, and that is why Vietnam has stunned them, or maybe turned them into a pack of rabid dogs. Then the later part of the text says, let me now share with you my thoughts on how my film should progress. The thoughts will naturally be somewhat chaotic. A Calcutta slum, a room, one of the shabbiest, a mother beside a sick child, a voice from outside, the mother draws some country liquor from a vessel in the corner, the sick child cries out, the smoke from a newly lit oven outside, the mother hands the bottle of liquor over to a man, a police whistle rises over the child's wailing, a mass of people run in from all sides and make a circle. the police whistle, the child wailing, the sound of a rocket taking off, an American bomber split into two in midair, it'll drop now. All this instills, for I would like to bring in the real war in Vietnam, all the time only instills. Against the stills I shall play out rhythmically the images of a living, moving country. Then towards the end of the text he says, then I propose to move on to a phase where I would project the dreams of the downtrodden as dreams, a phase that will be conceived entirely in musical terms and to a certain extent choreographically with no trace of realism at all. This phase will be illuminated by flashes of scenes of attack launched by brave young men and women of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. For they will appear to be determined to realize those dreams. The phase will come to a close with a scene of musical celebration with thousands of little children in a mad frenzy of dancing. Their dancing will be rhythmically joined to the scenes of the Liberation Army men jumping from trench to trench in their progress. In the last phase, I shall concentrate on upholding the militancy of the masses against a poem by Ho Chi Minh. In translation being recited loudly, there will be a sequence of scenes showing the struggling working masses in a wild abandon of activity. I propose to try to capture the pulsations of the life of the common masses that remain a mystery to the exploiters. I would like to embody in my film the spirit of life that sends its roots deep down into the earth and draws from its sap. The spirit that is born of hard steel and the sweat of the body, the spirit that breathes through the depths of contemplation where lies the profoundest peace. I do not know whether I would be able to capture it all, but I shall still try. This is how I propose to end my film. A young man hit by a bullet. He may be a student or a peasant. The young man will fall on his face on the ground with his scream, a combination of agony and ecstasy, ringing through the air. Even as he crumbled into death, he would snatch at the earth again and again with both his hands. My camera would reach beyond his hands to fix on the mass of blood with the earth sucking it up slowly. That is where another Vietnam is being born, a Vietnam that is immortal. This text was originally published in Bangla in a brochure for West Bengal Youth Festival in 1968, and this is Shamik Bandyopadhyay's translation. So I read this text a while ago, but today while watching From Ground Zero again, it came back with a full force what we were watching. So I would in fact like to start with the first part of Ghatak's reflection, where it says that, and that is where actually Godard's conjuncture, Ghatak's conjuncture and Vietnam, where the question of distance was quite different. In fact, especially the line where he says that to make a film I have to confine myself to Calcutta or to Bengal at the most. I don't consider it a hindrance. I would rather find it promising as a precondition for creativity in the arts. So with this, in fact, I would like to open up this question to you, sir, about the question of image and distance, especially within the context of aesthetic mobilization of the image, not the frenzy circulation of images in our own times, as we discussed yesterday too, the instantaneous repetition of social media and so on. So, so how do we look at this distance as a very precondition for artistic deployment of image, especially in a political conjuncture of Vietnam, Godard and Ghatak?
Yeah, no, thank you for reading out the text. I hadn't read it myself. And yes, you're right, because we have been, I myself have written about the Godard film. Again, you introduced the film to me. and then the reflections on the conjuncture, and then comparing that with the present moment in Palestine and Gaza. To have Ghatak's voice entering this scenario is really so. I didn't expect this. I was not. I was not conscious of this. So for me, this is really striking. So thank you for making me look in Ghatak's direction. Now, on the question itself, that he doesn't take this as a hindrance, this distance from Vietnam, and actually considers it to be an advantage, productive creative condition for kind of aesthetic mobilization. I think one of the reasons for that will be a sense of, because it's also Bengal and whatever is happening in the history of Bengal, particularly in the urban, concentrated in the urban pockets of Bengal in Calcutta, but not just urban pockets, because the Naxalite movement actually begins from the hinterland, but still it intensifies and sort of comes together as a movement in the urban center of Kolkata. So in that context, I think Ghatak is also responding, and it is not Ghatak alone. I was immediately reminded of another revolutionary poet in Bengal, the poet Shukanto. And there are other examples of this who also invoke Vietnam, because it seems to be more of a continuum, a kind of continuum of political enthusiasm, possibility, where Vietnam, like China, an earlier example of China, is taken as an avant-garde, as a kind of, we follow them in that sort of path. But there is a continuity. Unlike with Godard, because there the self-consciousness is more complicated and acute, because he belongs to the side of the world which is the aggressor, which is actually part of the imperialist forces which incite the war and invade the society that is Vietnam, which can be taken both in terms of West and non-West, but also more importantly as a political, an attempt to militarily and eventually politically crush a new vision of society, which would be called socialist. From Ghatak's position, this vision is shared. And he is not hindered by any immediate civil resistance of the sort that Godard is hindered by. Because both the dominant ideology is far more intensely capitalistic in the West at that time, and the state is clearly, it is occupied by imperialist ruling classes. Now, one is not saying that the Indian ruling classes are not part of the bourgeois, the ones who belong to the bourgeois part of society. Of course they are. And Hrithik Ghatak is aware of that, surely. But at least formally, they are not part of this. And we were talking about this in the morning, on an internationalist sort of a landscape horizon, they are not part of the Western bloc. They're actually part of the other bloc, which is the Soviet bloc. So that is an advantage at the national level for Hrithik Ghatak, that he doesn't have to enter that alienation that Godard has to necessarily experience, from which his camera eye springs. That's one reason, I think. And the other reason, the actual aesthetic details of his vision, of course, follow from the nature of militancy in Bengal. So that is, I think, more local to history of, maybe you'll also find that in the other movements in Andhra Pradesh, for instance, yeah, uh, and some other parts of the country, but definitely in Bengal, where a certain sort of organized militancy based on a particular kind of mass enthusiasm. People like Ghatak really, in their art, want to reflect that, and are also, not just reflect that, but they are also enabled by it. So much of his vision is enabled by what he himself calls mass militancy. But the most interesting line in that film is the one that applies to even today's times, where much of that political organization is missing. The internationalist landscape has completely changed. The position of the Indian state has drastically shifted. All of that is different. But one line, I think, remains absolutely relevant to our present experience, where Ghatak says that this mass enthusiasm is obscure to the exploiters.
Exactly.
The exploiters do not understand from where this
It's a
mass...
mystery. It's a mystery.
It's a mystery. It's a mystery.
Yeah.
Now that applies as much to today's protests that are taking place all over the world, particularly, which I have been again and again citing, particularly in Western world. Because the Western state from Vietnam up to now has remained imperialistic, violent, murderous, and also obscurantist, irrational. But more, not less, today, the people are rising in the West. This is a mystery to them, the ruling classes. That remains more or less constant, you know. But of course, the actual conditions, political conditions, forms of protest, forms of organization which organize these protests, they are fundamentally altered because the ideological distribution has changed. In a very fundamental way. So those are some of the, I think, factors which determine Ritik Ghatak's both statements and vision.
I was also thinking that one more element which we yesterday spoke at length, so I thought we could refer back to it, especially where he says that I would rather find it promising as a precondition for creativity in the arts, for the little that I have realized about Vietnam tells me that the fight is being fought here too, and Vietnam as a symbol and so on and so forth. That point he says that it enables a filmmaker to go beyond realism.
Yeah, of course. That is the further.
So that I think, in a certain sense, one can look at this whole question of image and a distance on two planes. The first is, of course, the aesthetico-political plane, as we discussed yesterday regarding montage. That montage is not about recording an event, but fragmenting and reconstructing and recomposing, which implies distance or distanciation. Yeah. So in theatre, you would have Brecht. In poetry, you would have Mayakovsky. Yeah. In cinema, Eisenstein to Ghatak. So in a certain sense, what we yesterday also talked about is a kind of an anti-mimetic understanding of image.
Yes.
Image slash montage, or image as montage, where Vietnam is not just a place, but a spirit, a thought, what he refers to eventually as immortal, as symbol, as a living reality of Vietnam, but which is not confined to Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So in a certain sense, the image which is more gestic in nature, which is trying to go at the heart of the essence of Vietnam, and that's where the question of distance, I thought, was of a very different order than, let's say, the other question where the image and the distance was posed after the Second World War, which is primarily concerning warfare. And Harun Farooqi, in fact, traces the long genealogy of a history of seeing as linked with history of warfare. Yeah. So essentially trying to overcome the fragility which an aggressor or a combatant would experience in a warfare by trying to improve the technology of war at a distance.
Of course.
Yeah. Right.
Of course.
So simulation, modeling and so on, and the kind of image making technologies which were simultaneously used in the production as well as in destruction, in the military industrial complex and so on and so forth, where the question of distance is primarily the physical distance. Yeah, a distance which also is linked with the logic of security. So development, security. Coupled together. So if one actually follows the second question, then I think a lot of development of technology which we yesterday kind of discussed upon is actually caught between these two lines. Yeah. Because the development of the lightweight cameras, yeah, and the image making technologies are primarily motivated, mobilized and financed or funded by the military industrial imperative. Then you have these aesthetico-political mobilizations of those, yeah. But what happens actually, I think as we come closer to our times, the gap between the two starts getting closed on, especially because let's say montage as a aesthetico-political sensibility starts waning, and a certain realist, let's say, understanding of image, photographic realism. I'm not talking about realism here in a more general sense, but in a more indexical photographic sense as we discussed. And we also looked at how that prevails in, let's say, the representational strategy of documenting the violence as it unfolds. Yeah, that because that evidence becomes an important tool, an instrument of resistance, of activism, of visibilizing what is going on and so on and so forth, where where the question of distance, as we were already beginning to discuss in the break, that Shomu sir was saying that there the question of distance actually is completely abolished, because you are now in the midst of the situation. So now the abolition of distance is taking place at both the levels, at a physical level, but also at an aesthetico-political level, that there is no space for that. So how do we actually reflect upon this, where you are exposed to the violence and you are actually creating an image of that very violence instantaneously?
Yes. Yeah.
So
No, I mean, these are things which are happening at so many levels, and so many tracks are really, in time they're moving, that it is not easy to make sense of all this. But of course, these are all real developments. First of all, going back to the earlier 60s sort of situation, and this specific Ritik Ghatak and Godard being at the same conjuncture in 68 or so, but speaking from very different situations. One of the interesting things in Ritik's Ghatak's responses, or his vision of that film he wanted to make on Vietnam, is that he's, you're right, he is of course, he's sort of putting this vision down in terms of some kind of a montage sequence, but he's doing this with a certain kind of continuity, a kind of indivisibility of duration that seems to be running more or less smoothly between his Bengal and Vietnam.
Yeah.
This is not the case with Godard.
Yeah.
In Godard, there is a certain division of duration. The very time experienced in Godard's West and the time you imagine unfolding in Vietnam, there is an abyss
Yeah.
between the two.
Yeah.
Now, it is true physically, Ritik Ghatak also says the same thing as Godard does, that he hasn't gone to Vietnam. Both say the same thing. And he too says what Godard says, that I don't really have a grip on Vietnam, I don't feel its pulse of life. That's an interesting statement, because I think both share one thing. At that time, whether in India or in the West, actually India more, your literal knowledge of Vietnam is very poor, very meager. Unlike our knowledge of Palestine today, it is far richer, even if not so systematic, than what an Indian, Ritik Ghatak is after all an intellectual, no, in the broadest sense. He's a filmmaker is an intellectual. An intellectual's knowledge of Vietnam, and Ritik Ghatak admits it, is very meager. Even Godard, though the Western archive is definitely richer, also because of a direct colonial relationship with Vietnam, yet, even Godard feels that poverty of having a grip on actual Vietnamese life, what in the morning we call world. You know, they both share a sense of distance. And yet you're right, Ritik Ghatak, in a way, once it comes into the aesthetic sort of register, even in his imagination, he finds a duration to travel between his position, his location, and Vietnam, which Godard does not. And hence Godard makes Camera Eye, which basically says, I have nothing to shoot. And yet every film I'll make will be about Vietnam. Now imagine the impasse or paradox of the statement. I have nothing to shoot, and yet every film I'll make will be about Vietnam. While Ritik Ghatak is saying that film about Vietnam, though I do not know much about Vietnam, will have literally this as a projected montage. This is a strikingly different response to the otherwise empirically same sort of epistemic distance that Ritik Ghatak and Godard share. So one of the reasons for that is the one we discussed a moment back, which is politically they are not located in the same sort of same kind of state. India is part of a broadly non-aligned configuration. To that extent, naturally closer to Vietnam and a kind of Vietnamese autonomous self-determination, a voice of self-determination. And the West is strongly oriented to crush that. That difference we understand very clearly, you know. And the affirmative side, that Ritik Ghatak can actually identify with a kind of, with even in the absence of actual social data, he can identify with the continuing spirit or duration of political energy from Bengal to Vietnam as part of a socialist energy, even more concretely as part of a Marxist solidarity. Now, Godard would have some kind of a political, I'm not using the term Marxist, but definitely a political solidarity with the Vietnamese cause, no doubt about that. All of them, all these intellectuals. But he's not able to ground it in any movement. Though it is true that in the 60s, when Godard is part of the anthology Far From Vietnam, there is a strong civil social unrest based on the inspiration of China and Vietnam and such societies and such events in the West. Yeah, that is there. That is there. And even the communist parties and the Maoist parties have, in his own time in France, strong affiliations with these movements. But still, I think Godard feels that sense of arrest, that he is not able to move. from where he is in Paris. Well, what is remarkable about this scenario that you read out from Ritik Ghatak, the sitting where he is, he's able to move so much. It's quite amazing, which Godard is not able to. You know? So to me, that is very interesting. Now, if you move from that point to now, your second part of your observations, then you're absolutely right. Even these distinctions are partly rendered indistinct or sort of flattened out by the fact that the economic sort of world has become more homogeneous. This sort of a non-aligned part of the world is different from the imperialist capitalist part of the world, and all that distribution is today strongly pushed to one side, which we call globalization. And of course, along with that, both the, like you pointed out, the developments in technology, but also a certain access to technology because of the nature of that technology and the market, which makes it accessible because it is more profitable to that very production system. That you can actually distribute that technology in two ways. One is in terms of its actual purposiveness. You purpose the technology in such a way that it becomes multi-purpose. So in the 60s, an instrument of war, and Harun Farooqi we'll talk about Harun Farooqi, I'm sure, in a moment. Harun Farooqi actually gives us earliest insights into this. But still, in the 60s, the instruments of war are still more specialized.
Yeah.
What is meant for war is meant for war, and what is meant for other kinds of activities, which are peacetime, artistic, are more or less for that purpose. More and more what you find is the same instrument, drones for instance. Drones are the best example. The whole film we saw had drones. Drones, it is very difficult to really talk about the purpose of drones. Drones can be purposed in such a flexible way that they can appear to be so useful, so immaculate, because they hardly require any human labor. And at the same time, they are the most destructive instruments of war. And also, they are the most convenient and useful resource for surveillance, and also artistic resource, and so on and so forth. So this sort of virtuosity of technology is something which we are definitely part of. Now, so the technical and economic changes that have happened in relation to the larger social system, which is more homogeneous and globalized, but that doesn't mean globalized and homogeneous doesn't mean harmonious.
Yeah.
There we go back to conflicts which remind us very much of the past, including the Vietnam conflict and other conflicts, because this homogeneous one flat world is also a space of intense transnational civil conflict, whether within societies or between societies. You know? So more and more what we see is that these wars that we experience are fought at many levels simultaneously, of course between nations. But at the same time, these wars have a reflection in America is a very good example of that. West in general is, I think, post-Gaza is a very vivid illustration of that, that the conflicts that take place, the reflections that take place within, say, the West of what is happening with America's and West's support of, not just support, but active participation in the assault on Gaza is something that is challenged with such militancy, though not organized, but still with such mass militancy, that mass militancy seems to be on the verge of civil war. Not a civil war, but on the verge of civil war. But paradoxically, and that is something we were discussing in the morning, it doesn't get reflected back into a proper political organization which takes it up as an alternative vision of society. Hence, it either results in actual crisis and fragmentation of society, or it suddenly lowers the stakes such that militancy becomes petitioning. You know, even though the mass militancy is more intense, not less today, than the times of Hrithik Ghatak and Godard. It is in that context, the films that we are seeing from 2010 to now, I think can be really very interestingly discussed. Yeah. In these both technical, economic distinctions, where, so the last point, about the actual question of war and the camera. Not just the camera, but the other instruments of war. Now, you know, I was talking about this yesterday. What happened was, when the situation in Gaza became more and more difficult for the governments to manage in the West, and people were rising up and protesting. In UK, for instance, the Palestine Action Group, which was proscribed and is now, the case is being fought, but on paper it's a terrorist organization. So if you go out and on behalf of or identify with Palestine Action, you are supporting terrorism. And so people do go to jail for that. On the one hand, this is happening, but because Israel and the war pushed things to such an extent in Gaza that UK came out, one of the first countries in the western part of Europe, came out with actually saying, we will support self-determination, a Palestinian state. The moment they did that, Mark Huckabee, who is the US ambassador to the UN, gave a statement addressing Keir Starmer, that Keir Starmer, if you were the Prime Minister of UK during the Second World War, the British would be speaking German by now. Now, what is the meaning of this? And he cited, that is, if you were the Prime Minister of UK when the Allies bombed Dresden, and you were the Prime Minister, the British would be speaking German by now. Now, what did he mean by that? Now, what he meant by that was something very interesting, and it has a historical reference. The Allied bombing of Dresden in Germany in the 1940s was one of the most dreadful bombings, because it was one of those bombings where the instruments of war, the bombs that were used, were chemical bombs. Zyklon was used, gas. Now, because it was gas which was spread through the atmosphere in the city of Dresden, there was obviously no distinction anymore between civilians and the Nazis, that is, the actual German soldiers. And so there was a massacre in Dresden. There was not only the mass dying, deaths, there was also the initial experience of poisoning. People started exhibiting long-term symptoms of warfare. Endless symptoms of different sorts of diseases, because your body was poisoned, because the air was poisoned. Not only that, it was captured on film simultaneously. And those were the first documentary images, if you want, indexical images or indexical recording of and I spoke about this yesterday, of what with Hiroshima will become the central emblem of our times. But this was the first instance where you saw the sky lit up. The sky was bombed. Bodies were not bombed. Buildings were not bombed. The sky was bombed. So if you have seen the film made by, Christopher Nolan, then you will know that the shooting of that scene of the Los Alamos, at the atomic bomb before Nagasaki was bombed, the actual trial bombing took place there, and Nolan insisted that he wants to shoot it not digitally, but actually shoot it, because he wanted to reproduce the burning of the sky and its image. That's because he already had a reference to the images that were indexable to these events, from Dresden to Hiroshima. So not only people like Nolan wanted to sort of, in a kind of documentary spirit, though they were making a fiction film, follow in that line of cinema verite. Not make cinema verite, but follow in that line. You know, follow that principle that we are not going to use digital manipulation. You're going to actually shoot it, stage it, create the conditions for that kind of thing. You know, not only that, there was also an aesthetic desire to find an image of thought for it. And that part is the one that is the most interesting but also the most disturbing. Why? Because to find a thought for an image, which actually is the image of the, and that is your point, I think, Vaibhav, which is the image of the greatest destructiveness. Not just in one instant of the bomb falling and in one instant thousands dying, but in indefinite temporal extension. For 100 years, God knows, people are getting poisoned. You're inheriting genes that are poison genes. And so it goes. Like it has happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, no? People are still dying. Or in Bhopal. Or in Bhopal, because it's the same phenomenon. Yeah. So these sorts of things, which was its real, to be translated into terms of aesthetics, which is basically to find a mimetic measure for it, is both a fascinating project but a disturbing project. Hence, I cited to you something that is both so interesting but so disturbing that someone can, and it was done, someone can equalize the Hiroshima sky burning to Marilyn Monroe's face. That is what someone said, that it has the fascination and the beauty, but also at its own level, its horror. It is the equivalent of Marilyn Monroe's face in the sphere of war. Now, this project of trying to find a mimetic measure for something that that is so singular and exceptional and real, is something that in cinema continues to challenge, but also to raise questions of both mimesis, but also a certain kind of, not just ethics, but a certain kind of relationship to the real. You know? So either, and that's my last point for the moment, so either you say that cinema cannot really do justice to the real. That is not cinema's vocation. What cinema can do is to find a parable form, a small form, a kind of caricatural form even, but not at the level of the real. Yeah? It can transmit the real, but with another register. Lower the stakes, aesthetic stakes, from the intensity of the real, because if you do that, then you are making cinema and war and death indistinguishable. And that is unacceptable.
Absolutely.
And it is a fascist vision, because this is exactly what 1920s futurists, in a sense, put down in their manifestos, that art and death should have the same level of being. So if you don't do that, then either you develop a strategy of that sort, which Harun Farooqi, I think, started doing in a pioneering way. Or you say that cinema must find something, in a way Godard is trying to do that, cinema must find something in itself which is a kind of confessional mode. It must keep making the film which it cannot make by confessing its sterility, by confessing its powerlessness, but you must do it as a direct address. So So in that sense, subtract from the image. The point you raised yesterday. Bring the voice into the hollow, into an emptiness, a flat voice of truth, but a truth which can do nothing for you. Again, something which must empty out that space where you thought you could actually grasp the real truth cinema. You have to let go of that. So these are some things that have developed over the years. But I think it is interesting that with Ritik Ghatak, you don't really find that sort of inhibition. You find in Ritik Ghatak a sense of possibility, that we can actually build a continuity from here to there, from here to elsewhere. So from where we are speaking, is it possible to speak a little further in Ritik Ghatak's spirit today? I do not know. But we can have the discussion with everyone. Yeah, I suppose, yeah. So these are some points, yeah. Sorry, I took a bit long, but I just thought I should, yeah.
He was already having a thought maybe you want to express.
No, I was just thinking about this idea of distance is framed as mediation as well in theory, right? So, I mean, I don't know where to start, so I'm going to start at the idea of narrative. And I guess you guys spoke about this yesterday, which is how images are being circulated non-stop, and there is very little distance between, what's happening and what is represented on our mobile phone screens and things like that, right? So, this Korean German philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, he talks about how narrative itself is in crisis, because you have a lot of images that are being thrown at us, but without a narrative thread. It's all about instant, unmediated images, right? So you have TikTok and Instagram and stuff where even the idea of story, on Instagram we see stories, but they don't really have a narrative, really, right? Even though they're called stories. So now the claim is that mediation is being lost, so distance, I guess, is being lost, but also narrative is being lost, and which is I think Byung-Chul Han frames it as an existential problem, right? Like how he says it is, when we're old and grey, we look back at our lives and we've done a lot of things, we've collected a lot of experiences, but there's no narrative thread. So that's an existential crisis that we will see in a few years, right? So in that sense, the political value of art and philosophy hinges on distance, right? And this distance, again, the question is what kind of distance is good and what kind of distance is not so good, because, or what kind of mediation is good and what kind of mediation is not good, because films offer mediation, but like you said, it could expose us to the real. I'm guessing you're talking about the psychoanalytic real.
Well, in the sense, the real as something which, in its very upsurge, doesn't have any form of representation. So, so in that sense, the impossible, yes.
The impossible,
No, but we must also explain what we mean by the impossible, because it really means that it is not transmissible without some displacement, which means, so we need to thread it to some other thing than itself. So that is, the problem.
It's not part of the symbolic.
As if, as it is, in a sense, as it is traumatically experienced. Exactly.
So, but in the in the aesthetic dimension of films and visual arts, and even music to some extent, because these are all composed, they're all compositions. You're able to transform what is
absolutely
in real life into something that's sort of accessible.
Absolutely.
So could you then say
That is the challenge, yes.
Sorry?
No, that is the challenge. You're right. Carry on.
So then how? So is the question then what I was saying, right? Like, is the question then to determine what is good and bad mediation or good and bad? Is there a sweet spot? I guess is my question. Of how do we arrive at that sweet spot where you're seeing, I don't know, you're sort of getting a peek into the real so that you can act upon it.
Yes.
So how do to find that sweet spot, or is it both? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this is it's not a well-formed question, I understand, but yeah.
Do you want to respond? Please.
So, coming to the second part of it, where basically you're looking at, in some sense, a balance or a synthesis or some way of bringing both these logics together. I'll start from there and then we can go back to Byung-Chul Han, crisis of narration and so on and so forth. So, yesterday we touched upon it from a different direction. Today we are upfront taking the problem of narration. So, I think it can also be dealt with through a certain vocabulary we developed yesterday, so those who were here yesterday could also be able to connect with it. So, we started with this proposition that cinema is not merely accumulating images but also organizing images. So, insofar as that it's a relation and juxtaposition between images, there is a narrative there. But that narrative need not always be the same as story or a plot in a classical literary or the dramatic sense. Yeah. So, already with cinema, the idea of narrative gets complicated. Yeah. Jacques Rancière says something very interesting, that if cinema is art, then it has two logics, which is, first is the logic of image, and the second is the logic of sequence, the ordering of the image. He says that the logic of image interrupts the logic of sequence or thwarts the logic of sequence only to regenerate it. So, the thwarting is not its end. The regeneration is what takes place, and yet the regeneration is also not its end because there is again thwarting. So, it's a continuous back and forth between the thwarting and the regeneration. That's how he is kind of saying that how cinema manages to thwart the teleology of modernist art. That especially the modernist teleology in case of cinema was that cinema can be without story, plot, or any connection with classical arts, so to say bourgeois arts. So, Zigaverto declares at the beginning of Man with Movie Camera that here is a new international language of proletariat, which has no resemblance to literature, to drama, to music, all the decadence. It's purely a language of image. Yeah. Now, Rancière actually raises a very interesting question. Can at all there be a language of image, or is image is fundamentally interrupting the very logic of language, which is that of signification, yeah, sense making, and so on and so forth. And then of course he is developing that through what he calls as the shifts which are taking place in the field of aesthetics, emergence of aesthetic regime in 19th century. In painting, yeah, the shift which is taking place from the figurative realist painting to a certain kind of an abstraction, but that abstraction becomes apparent only in 20th century, yeah, in the modernist avant-gardist work, but it is already apparent in Dutch masters, in the 18th century still life. That became most crucially apparent in 19th century with Cézanne, that you are not just painting an apple, but there is already a interruption of the figurative by figurative. So, you see apple in a concrete sense, but you also see lines and strokes and the application of color and so on and so forth. So, if that is what one could call a sweet spot, yeah. Because actually in the history of cinema, certain filmmakers have actually found or traced their aesthetic conception back to Cézanne, and one of the most recent one is again a South Korean great filmmaker, Hong Sang-soo, says that there is a Cézanne tendency in cinema. And he says, I can always identify when I watch a Cézanne tendency at work. And he creates his own sequence or a constellation and so on and so forth. The names are Jean Renoir, Louis Buñuel, Robert Bresson, Jean Ford, John Ford, and Eric Romer. Now, some of you may have seen, some of you may not, so we will not get into the details of the films per se. He says then in each of these cases, I see a certain balance which is neither tilting on the side of image nor on the side of narrative. Just to say what? That narrative is not subassuming or subordinating images, nor images are completely trying to escape and abandon narrative. Yeah. So in a way, one could actually enter this whole question of the crisis of narration via, let's say, this tension also, that how cinema is trying to organize this crisis or a response to this crisis, right? That it's pretty much born out of that very crisis also. So in a sense, it's not outside of that crisis. Because of the logic of image, if that one takes as, let's say, defining feature of cinema, then of course it is very much a part of that crisis. But at the same time, and this is where Rancière's preposition is very sharp, where he says that in a way, cinema is it's a kind of a thwarted fable, that it interrupts its very promise, that it can actually go beyond the art of telling to art of showing, but it interrupts that very promise by bringing back the art of telling in a full-scale manner, so that the story is reinstated, plot is reinstated, characters are reinstated, narrative is reinstated, to an extent that it poses a challenge to filmmakers. And here I'll refer to Wim Wenders. He's also been in conversation with Byung-Chul Han, and Crisis of Narration emerged through their conversation, to an extent that when Wim Wenders was on his India tour, a lot of the ideas from Byung-Chul Han's book, he was also talking about it in his interviews, especially this whole crisis of story selling as opposed to storytelling, as he was talking about. So Wim Wenders has written a fascinating text called, which is part of an ontological logic of images, called Impossible Stories. So he came from the visual art background, and he was always skeptical of stories, and he always thought stories as a lie or a fabrication. Yeah. So he wanted to escape story while creating a sequence of images. So he planned 10 shots of a city, and the aspiration was that all these shots can be arranged in any order. There should not be any definitive order, because he wanted to escape the logic of meaning or signification or progression, resolution, whatever. But something took place while he was shooting. So a shot was that there's a rail track, and he wanted to shoot the arrival of the train. And he was waiting. He knew that the train is going to arrive in next 2 minutes. So well in time, he started his camera, and somebody ran across the track. Then it became a problem, because each of these shots were actually not only static tableaus, but were supposed to be empty. No human figure was planned in any of the shots. That is why he thought of completely creating a free order. But now this human figure has crossed. So where do we put this shot? You put it in the beginning, then the subsequent shots will be read in relation to this. Put it in the middle, the same effect, that it would cast a retrospective shadow as well as anticipation. Or if you bring it towards the end, again, then everything we've seen till then would be seen in the light of this, leading up to this, so on and so forth. And lots of assemblies he tried, and he eventually realized that hard way, that in cinema you can't escape story, or you can't escape narration. But at the same time, cinema is not just about narration, but about sustaining that very tension between the image and the story. So he found his way out, and that way out is a very interesting response to what Hong Sang-soo calls as a Cézanne tendency. Like every filmmaker has to find their way out of this conundrum. It's the most fundamental part. If at all cinema is an art, it's an art of this problem. Everything else is actually like a source material or a raw material for cinema. So, so what he thought was that let's look at stories as maps. So he would take up the map of Germany and randomly decide upon an itinerary, yeah, and then start traveling, and as he travels, the narrative would unfold in a very open-ended, unplanned, spontaneous manner. But he would still have fixed itinerary, that I'm going to start from here and end here. So one of the most popular films from this road film cycles he made, called Alice in the Cities. Yeah. So this young girl Alice, now a stranger asks, a woman asks a stranger to take care of Alice, and then she disappears. Now the stranger has to take this young girl Alice somewhere. Alice has a very vague memory of her grandmother's town. She's not even very sure about the name of it. And she just has a photograph of the place where the grandmother lives. Just on the basis of that, now this whole journey begins. Yeah. Or a film like Kings of the Road, where two people encounter, one is a projectionist, the other is about to commit a suicide, the projectionist saves him against his wishes or will, and now they both are traveling together. The work of the projectionist to go and fix actually the projectors in different smaller towns in Germany, and then that becomes the route through which their story unfolds. So these are the ways in which the open-ended nature of a cinematic composition or a construction is held in tight balance with a certain logic of necessity which enters. So the contingency, necessity. Like how do you kind of compose the relationship between them together? So in the same manner, one could say that the problem of distance and proximity to cinema, that it's neither entirely on the side of distance nor entirely on the side of proximity. So even as you said, that we find ourselves in a situation where there is no distance, the distance has kind of abolished, there is instantaneous repetition and so on, how to still minimally constitute a distance remains a problem. And it remains an aesthetic problem. And as Shomu sir suggested, that one can actually look at the work, Palestinian films, in last 15 years as a response to that problem. Yesterday I spoke at length about it, that how Five Broken Cameras minimally constitutes that distance, how No Other Land is self-conscious of the shrinking of that distance and modestly acknowledges that shrinking, right? Because in both these cases, there is a continuous onslaught of the settler colonial project, yeah, which is documented as it unfolds. Yeah. The violence which is inflicted on bodies, bulldozer, displacement, extinction, so on, evacuation, eviction, and so on and so forth. And then I propose that maybe one could also see another strategy at work in films like Samoni Road and Lid, and also some of the short fragments in from Ground Zero, which is a more subtractive, speculative strategy, what Sir was referring to as a small form, that you rescale the reality. Instead of representing the reality at the very scale and the level at which you unfold, you take a distance from it at the level of representation. Yeah. So animation. So it could be a stop motion animation as we saw, or charcoal animation in Samoni Road. And in Samoni Road, the animation also touches upon various registers. The register of memory, of televised images, of surveillance footage, in Lid of the newsreels. Then today we also saw other registers also, that there is a segment called Fragments, where he is doing charcoal drawings. Yeah. Or in the last fragment, it's called Awakening, yeah, puppets. So that's also kind of a rescaling. So either one produces a counterpoint to the visible surface of the images through voice, by making something visible, by opening the images to something which is beyond the frame, something which cannot be grasped at the sensory level, which needs to be thought about. And I was tracing that to the emergence of actually essay film in the post-war Europe, particularly in France, the Alain René and Chris Marker's collaboration. And the way, let's say, Alarane and Marker uses voice in their shorter works as well as longer works as a counterpoint to image is also another way of sustaining that tension between image and narration. This is a kind of a montage between the visual and the sonic part, the audio part. And the rescaling is another way, and in case of Farooqi's Inextinguishable Fire, that rescaling is also mobilized with a didactic function, that it's a kind of a learning play.
So just to explain that bit, for people who might not have seen Inextinguishable Fire, it has something to do with the vividity and power of that image which came along with the, so that's also the question of the real. The real of Hiroshima. The real of Hiroshima is what? It can be many things. But one of the immediate images that came along with Hiroshima was this sky on fire. It started with Dresden. So this Huckabee guy, he's basically telling Keir Starmer that if you got too swayed or too affected by that real of what you yourself did in Dresden, and your conscience was pricked by it, and you de-intensified the real. Suppose you stopped bombing Germany, then what would have happened? Hitler would have won? No. And so they would have conquered you, and so you would be speaking German today. See, this is Huckabee's logic. So if you got too affected by the real, that, oh God, what did we do? We killed so many civilians, we poisoned the air, and we have a sort of immediate record of it in this impossible image of the sky on fire. So let's stop bombing. Huckabee is saying, you guys get affected by these little things and you stop bombing Germany, then what would have happened? Hitler would have won. So same story applied to Gaza. So you are getting affected by what we are doing or whatever Israel is doing, and we are pretty much hand in hand with them. You get affected by that. Then what you'll have is Islamism on a global scale. What you'll have is such barbarism as Hamas on October 7th. And so it goes.
Yeah.
So don't get affected by the real. Just carry on with what you're doing. That was Huckabee's logic. To whom? Not to a revolutionary, but to the most doubtful politician on the European landscape, Keir Starmer. To him, he's sending such a message. Imagine the kind of threat of the real, but also the immediate need to dissolve the real into some new discursive mystification or some new imperative that just carry on with that imperative. Keep bombing because it's a securitarian imperative. Now, it is in such a clear blockage, I mean, not just a blockage, a paralysis, an atrophy of any possibility of working this out, what is going on, that this other point arises of strategic shift of scale, a new teaching of the image. So Harun Farooqi, in the case of Hiroshima, what it does is something, and again thanks to Vaibhav, I saw the film.
Not sure, Vietnam, napalm bomb.
Oh, sorry, napalm bomb. Yeah, not Hiroshima, you're right. Napalm bombing. But yeah, it could very well have been any of those. Because again, napalm bombing has an image, which is, I don't know how many of you have seen it, that girl running on fire. So that image has been there. And there is a lot of difficult narratives inbuilt. Godard's first film proposal in Far From Vietnam was not the one we see. It was something else, which was Chris Marker, who was organizing the whole thing, and his colleagues refused to accept that film, where he wanted to show, again, a woman. So this gender question is very much in the center of this whole story. He wanted a woman, a young woman, exploding on the screen. Basically, again, trying to find the measure in cinematic image of the real of the napalm bomb. You know, the doubling of the actual image, which is, you can think of it as documentary, indexical, whatever, in the fiction form of a film where a woman would explode. And he actually said that the only measure I can think of the real of the horror is to think of the tenderest thing blowing up. For me, that is a beautiful woman. Think about this. Think about the perilous but search for truth on part of an artist. So it's all on edge. But his search is for the search of the truth of the real. That the real of what happens in a napalm bomb, for me, can only be scaled or sort of translated into the tenderest thing I can imagine for it to blow up. That is, for me, a beautiful woman. And I want to show that on screen. They said, no way you're doing that. So that film got, thankfully shelved.
This is like method acting as well, isn't it?
Well, that is still acting. This is not even acting. Yeah. This is kind of, he wanted to create an automatic image of the tenderest vitality, which is for him the beautiful woman. So that was immediately cut off. And what we see instead is what we see now. Now, what Harun Farooqi did with that same problem of the real is something completely. He made a didactic, almost Brechtian project out of it. He taught you the real. How? So what he did was, if you haven't seen the film, he himself, as a filmmaker, but also as an object of teaching, both object and vehicle of teaching, a kind of midwife. You see him on screen with a lit cigarette pressed to his hand. Now, see, a lit cigarette is bad enough, but it is, and he says so, it is a infinitely scaled down version of the real of the napalm bomb. So what he does is, first he shows you the actual gesture, so it's a gestic kind of teaching, yes, of that thing burning into his skin, and then he gives you the exact measure. So this is how many centigrades on my skin, what it does to you, and then multiply it by that many number, and you get a sense of what happens with a napalm bomb. For us to get an objective measure of intensity, which to us has subjectively come as an image, to which we react with horror or we react with fascination, or both. Harun Farooqi is trying to constitute a distance through a practice of the image, which is didactic. But, and that's why, again, Vaibhav taught me that Harun Farooqi becomes a new paradigm of documentary thinking, of documentary cinema and its thought. So, I mean, that whole story he can tell better, and we don't have to go into those things. We're not doing a workshop on documentary cinema. We can do that some other day. Whatever it is a whole line of practice and thought that starts from, and it is carried on to now. Now our question is, and maybe we can open it up from here on, when we see the films that we are seeing between yesterday and today on Palestine, and in the context of the real of what has happened, which of these practices and what new practices do we get a glimpse of? I think that can be a very useful discussion at the end.
Absolutely.
Because we have seen some things now. Northernland is a well-known film after Oscar. Yeah, we saw it. This is such a rich film of so many fragments, so many little films, and it is an anthology film. Yeah. And then the glimpses we saw of other films, and we have seen other stuff in our own seeing of films. So it would be interesting to think of many, we don't have much time anymore, but whatever little. So yeah, I mean, if you people have some questions, comments, thoughts, having seen what you have seen in relation to the practice of the image, given this problem of this real, of in this case war, in Vietnam War, but the war itself has its sort of automatism of the image too. So you have the image in Napalm, image Hiroshima, image Dresden, and image in the present of Gaza. You know? So yeah, that could be a discussion. So, I mean, so what we saw in this film, if you have some thoughts about that, some responses, some people?
Along with whatever has been discussed right now, in Godard's film, there's a very interesting moment. Whatever brief part of the film we saw yesterday, he says, my ideology is vague right now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you said that. Yeah.
When I try to speak it with the Vietnamese, they will not agree with it. They will not find it practical. They will find it abstract. And that's acceptable. That's completely, he says, it's true. So we have been speaking of a place of truth coming from a place of weakness, place of void, formlessness, etc. Again, speaking through the point of view of organization and whatever we have been watching for last yesterday and today, a lot of things sort of kept reoccurring, and which did not have a structured place to put those words. Where do you place these words? One was time. I mean, from today's film, actually, these words got reimbursed on my mind very strongly. One was time, and even yesterday there was a word, patience, sabr, what he said.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna put these words across, and
Absolutely.
Godard, somehow it's a vague idea, which emerges from the image, if I'm using it correctly.
Yeah, see, with Godard, things are a little more serious. Of course, he says that his ideology is. He didn't get a visa, no? He didn't get permission to go to Vietnam. Joris Evans was the only one who got permission. So Godard reflected on that. And one of the possible theories why only Joris Evans among the filmmakers got permission and no one else did to go to Vietnam was that with the rest of them, with each of them, there was a suspicion, despite their sympathies with the Vietnamese cause, still their position ideologically was not rigorous enough for the ones evaluating whether it's okay to call them to allow them to come to Vietnam. With Joris Evans, because Joris Evans had a long history of being, as a filmmaker, associated with certain socialist states. For instance, he, including Vietnam, he had already met Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh actually knew Joris Evans, you know. With the others, there was, because this is something which is a story, which is a very serious story with communist organization particularly, but with all organization, but particularly communist organization, that even with the sympathizers, so it would be very interesting to bring this in relation to Ritwik Ghatak. Because absolutely the same doubt Ritwik Ghatak himself reflects on in his last film. That I know that even the ones I sympathize with are suspicious of my intellectual status, I'm still too bourgeoisie. My ideology is still too, like you correctly point out from Godard, still too vague. And I'm not rigorous enough for the party. So the party still thinks of me as a bourgeois, you know, petit bourgeois. If not, because he's a drunkard too, so he's decadent. No, but this is a constitutive uncertainty. So Godard's alienation is not just vis-a-vis other questions of distance that we've discussed. It is as much internal to his relation to the very cause he's sympathetic with, from his class position as an intellectual. You know? And he kind of, you're right to point out, I also noticed it when I saw the film with the subtitles from very close, because otherwise I can't read these things, that he did say this, my ideology is vague, and that I understand if they are not sure about me. Because it is very concrete. He reflected on why he was not allowed, just like most of his colleagues were not. And Joris Evans was. Because Joris Evans had a kind of credential. He was a see, it was even more pinpointed. Joris Evans was not seen as a filmmaker. He was seen as a journalist. And these guys were seen as filmmakers, which is still too big an art, and to that extent, it can be used for very different purposes. Journalism is defined as with the purpose of some kind of factual truth-telling, far more, clearly utilizable. With film, you're not so sure what to do with this. So this is a very interesting point you raise about Godard. And once you raise this point, it immediately strikes me that we can think of these very questions with regard to Indian cinema filmmakers, particularly Hrithik Ghatak, or someone like Hrithik Ghatak. Cinema ideology, and then the actual aesthetic tools that a filmmaker uses. Because one of the usual suspicions is the moment a filmmaker, and Godard would be a case in point, the moment the filmmaker makes use of tools that are formalistically sort of new and innovative, there is the danger that a certain socialist aesthetic canon would find it, or an aesthetic norm would find it elitist and alienated from the masses. And what is interesting is all left intellectuals who are true intellectuals, including filmmakers, are aware of this. Godard is aware of this. Hrithik is aware of this. Each of them reflects on this strange position in their own relation to the movement and the party, or the parties they are, not part of, but sort of in conversation with. Each of them is. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. Really interesting point.
In other films, like Chudhury is one film where he, sorry, I'll just finish this quickly, and where he's also critical of the French Maoism.
Of course, all of that. Yeah, all of that. But that's the point, that with each of these filmmakers, you cannot take them piecemeal. You cannot say that, oh, this part of Godard I'm going to take and that part is not for me.
Yeah.
Just like you can't do that with Hrithik Ghatak. Or at least I don't recommend you doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, but coming back to, just to finish, I don't know whether this isolation from the mass is it a condition for thinking, as we saw it in the piece that Vaibhav read from it, or is it just situational that it happens? But the words that stood out from the films we have been watching since yesterday and today were very interesting and very, very forceful, very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And again, coming from a very space of weakness, space of no distance, space of engagement, and still carrying a lot of force, which faith, hope, God, patience, were these repeatedly occurring words, regardless of which God, which faith, detached from mythology, detached from any other narrative that those words might carry. In those situations, they arise, they reoccur again.
No, so yeah. Anyway, Vaibhav,
No, I mean, I kind of take all of these words as basically different ways of talking about what we've been discussing as Palestine as world. Like what is it that holds it together? It's concrete fragility, let's say. Not the romantic or the poetic fragility, but it's concrete fragility and ephemerality, which is inseparable from its resilience. which is inseparable from the resistance, which is inseparable from the, let's say, the uncertainty, the looming uncertainty under which it continues to exist. So one could say that these films in each of their own ways are trying to produce an imagination of that world, while their representational strategies may be distinct. Yeah, one may be to document the violence as it unfolds, but it is not just doing that in a factual, informative, journalistic sense of accumulation or curation of images. It is a construction of a certain narrative, as he was saying about. And that narrative is primarily that Palestine exists and how it continues to exist and how it continues to get destroyed and rebuilt before our eyes, and yet remains not purely visible to our eyes at the same time. So the other strategies, which are more speculative and subtractive, are focusing more upon that part in terms of making that visible. So one could in fact say that these, and thanks for bringing these words together, kind of, because it's a kind of a constellation of these words which together kind of tell us about the idea of Palestine as a world.
And there is no reason to think that, in any case, at this level, we can't club Ritik Ghatak and Godard and other filmmakers. These are singular, creators. But there is no reason to think that Godard is not speaking from a position of faith. Maybe God is not a word which will come in a, at least not in a unproblematic way. But there's no reason to think Godard is a creator without faith.
No.
Yeah, but then the word faith itself can be understood in a way that has to be actually learned from Godard himself, rather than we giving some meaning to Godard. So to that extent, to say that every film that I'll make will be about Vietnam is a commitment to Vietnam. It is an act of faith, without falling into bad faith. That I can make a film on Vietnam because I have the power of cinema. No, that's bad faith. But to say exactly your point, from a point of absolute weakness, every film I'll make will be a film about Vietnam, is an act of faith. It is the most affirmative, creative act anyone could commit oneself to. But it would be an act of faith, bad faith, to say, oh, I have the power, like we generally do. Oh, things are bad, but we have the camera. Let's record it. As if that, and you saw, and that's why Northern is a very good film, because you saw bits of that as good desire but bad faith, which was getting undercut by their own conversation. Yeah. It is so interesting. I could understand all this through help from others, but still I could get this much, that one person would say, well, we are doing this as if the desire is that this should bring us something. Yeah. And the other one is, no, like you point out, it's not going to bring you anything right now, visibly. Have faith, give time. But the desire is on the verge of bad faith. That I have the camera, why am I not getting a result? So it is quite extraordinary to have this sort of a real self-reflexive, but in a non-formalistic way. Because the film obviously is made with a form which is very straightforward, apparently. Very straightforward, apparently. Unlike some other films that we've seen between yesterday and today. Yeah, sure.
Say just for, I think, the ground zero one that we've watched, it
Yeah.
being like an anthropology-like situation.
Yeah.
And it being local filmmakers in Gaza and us not knowing which one is real, what we were talking about.
Outside, yeah.
There, it actually gives it a sense of a reality, like, again, this distance being broken in a very different way, because I'm now not looking at everything that I'm watching as either fact or fiction. is faith to resilience, faith to existing, faith to keep Palestine alive as more than an idea. And because we see that in so many ages, right? Like there are from kids to elders, from people that have lived in so many generations of Palestine, giving us so many different modes of storytelling. I think that it was a very well put way of connecting us to reality in a form that shows you that at the base, whether it's fact or fiction or animation or anything that they've created, their base is a faith and a hope for the future of Palestine. And that helps you connect with them in a way where distance is less of a question.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we were talking about this outside, and though clearly some parts of these films are staged or with the purpose of filming, some are found footage, some are with a will to document something. It's a mix, but you can't really make the distinction you can't really follow the distinction point to point, but also you're not looking for the distinction. Because of the films themselves, no doubt, but also because you're right, these films seem to almost emerge spontaneously from the historicity of that experience itself. So in that sense, while it is not, there is no constitutive gap, and because literally they are made more or less simultaneous with the events, and we are seeing them while the events are still happening. So literally there is no gap, but also the not having distance doesn't mean collapse of the two things.
Exactly.
Right? So this is the interesting thing. These are acts of cinema. So in that sense, there is a singularity and a specificity, and you're also right that they seem to flow from life, but they also produce a perspective on life, but from within life itself. Rakesh was saying when he was sitting next to me, we were watching the film, that in death there is so much life, and cinema is part of that. But that doesn't mean that everything is collapsed into some one black hole or bubble, not at all.
It would be interesting to actually study the kind of journalistic material which was circulating in those first 3 months along with this, or last 2 years for that matter, and then one could actually understand how that minimal distance is constituted while one is compelled to kind of, so it's not that you willingly immersed into it. You're thrown into it. Most of the stories are also about that you're caught unaware, that you did not expect something like this will happen, and you're completely shattered, and you have to think on your feet and so on. And yet you, in each of these segments, in fact, if you see this segment of a filmmaker whose film is now shown in a festival and is not being able to attend that, so his desire to kind of collectively watch that film with the audience, to an extent eventually he burns the clapboard. Sorry cinema. But it is cinema. So in a sense, it is a letter written to cinema, or a selfie which is an anonymous letter which is now sent to the sea. Probably we are the ones who are receiving it, or anyone would receive it. Or the film which is the Taxi Valisa, where suddenly the film is interrupted and says that I wanted to end it in a certain way, but because this tragic event has happened in my life, I can't end it in that way anymore. So my testimony will be.
That was actually the one where I broke, like the fourth wall was completely broken.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I was unsure of that film, whether I was following a real life or
Yes.
And then when we heard it from the director's perspective, it was like, bringing us back to the actual distance that is being created between a story and a reality.
Absolutely.
But it merges so well, like it intertwines so well with
Yes.
Absolutely. But at the same time, breaking that wall does not mean that we can immediately access what's going on. That itself is a strategy of constituting a distance. So by breaking that wall, you're making us aware of the construction of the film itself. It's not that you can directly now access the reality in any unmediated way, as you were saying earlier, that it's a question still of mediation, but here you are reflecting upon that mediation. It's not an abolition of mediation, it's not unmediated, it's not transparent in that sense. So one could in fact look at a thread which runs through some of these constellations and see in what ways, like I was thinking about particularly the letter form, which is there in Selfie and in Overburden. So in Overburden, she's telling us about the books she would have liked to brought, but there's so much of burden of the grief and the loss and so on and so forth, and yet she keeps talking about a literary work, and she feels being trapped in it because it is about Nakba, and she's not being able to return to her home, and she feels that, oh, I do not want to be fated like that. So that, and then the later reference to Nakba, which comes in the very last, the puppet one, where the husband, wife and the son are reunited in the present, but the husband actually has lost his memory and he still thinks that it is either the past, which is Nakba, or is it still 2014 when he had lost his memory. So this kind of reference back to Nakba, which was yesterday there in Lid also, I think is the most important part about last 15 years. And that's what I was referring yesterday to, that it is with the new historians, there is an analytical focus on the centrality of Nakba. Yeah. Later, the settler colonial framework also brings about its centrality, but the way these films are actually now, it's almost like the traumatic event of Nakba and its memory becomes extremely important to make sense of what is happening in the present, because that's a kind of an inaugural erasure. And today what we see is an erasure of that very erasure. So unless one recovers the inaugural erasure, the fiction of Palestine cannot be recovered. So it's a very strange interconnection between that erasure and a fiction of historical Palestine with which we started. So in a sense, that it is with that erasure, historical Palestine re-emerges as a desire.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's not that to go back to historical Palestine in some term, restoring the pre-1948 one. Now it's a desire for a new, for something new. So insofar as that, I felt that this whole question of real, as we were talking about earlier, could also be linked with what Shomu sir yesterday and today also referred to as that despite this kind of a mass militancy which takes a petitioning form and which does not have really the objective organizational form as it was in a relatively better state in 1960s with parties and organization, nor we have actually the objective form of this will, yeah, or this desire for Palestine, because we are not entirely sure whether state is that form for it, and yet the will actually finds a certain source of sustenance in that everyday living reality. I think these films are trying to give form to that there is a kind of a, so what you were earlier also talking about absolute weakness, one, because I was thinking about the last term in the title of the session called Thought of Politics. What thought of politics one actually senses in these films of last 15 years. It is primarily this, that we are at a cusp of a moment where we perhaps are undergoing the second Nakba. We can't let that happen. We need to keep the memory of the Nakba alive and the historical fiction of the Palestine alive amidst the organizational weakness of the political form, something of that.
Actually, this history question is there in the, I don't know Arabic, but whatever little I have learned from books I have read, this word Nakba is a catastrophe, but also a turn in time. So the historical grounding of Nakba is very important. If you compare the word Nakba to the word as it is used, I'm not talking the word
Kind
as
of
such.
an abyss?
A kind of abyss, but a significant historical turn. Yeah. If you compare that with the biblical word, though I'm not going into the word as such, but it's appropriation and general dominant usage, apocalypse, then you see the difference. The apocalypse, which is also a catastrophe, is seen as something which is an end of time. In that sense, with a total collapse, but also a messianic promise. So the Holocaust, peculiarly retrospectively, of course, no one could ever think of the Holocaust as a promise as it was unfolding. But strangely, with the Holocaust and post-Holocaust formation of Israel, the promise as if it was being fulfilled, a Zionist promise, is as if an absolute clean slate. In that sense, a willing erasure of all history. That is not the case with the thought of the Nakba. Even though the actual scale of suffering and death is comparable to other such events in history, the Palestinian Nakba. But the thought of it, the discussion around it, is not of the same order as the discussion around an apocalypse. Not really of the messianic order. However much some organizations, including an Islamist organization like Hamas, might kind of create an Islamist apocalyptic scenario, and in a way you could say, I'm not sure I want to make it a theoretical proposition, but you could say that October 7th was also a kind of messianic spectacle. I'll do such violence that it will fall out of this world. You could speak like that in media society. But even that must have historical consequences. So many theories about why October 7th happened have been tried out by scholars of Israel-Palestine history, and some of them are that whatever they did was to bring history back to focus, the Palestinian history, because Palestinian history was getting normalized, flattened out. They did it in the most atrocious way, but the reason was historical, not theological. In that sense, nothing to do with some absolute religious mission. Even if Hamas is an Islamist organization. So you have to reinsert Islamism into history, rather than the other way around, that sublimate history into some theology. But with the biblical tendency of an apocalyptic thinking, and Israel uses that as a matter of banal everyday language, it is as if we can start from a clean slate. And there is a terrible, even cold-blooded use of something as horrifying as the Holocaust for that purpose. You know? So in that sense, I agree with Vaibhav that the question of the Nakba is a question of history, and if the memory is to be recovered, it must be recovered at the level of history, not as some absolute memory of some absolute suffering of an absolute people.
Yeah.
This is what, in a discussion with the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, Elie Saunders, a French Palestinian journalist, said that what Israel is saying is, we are like no other people. What we are saying is, we are like any other people. This distinction of the same, so to speak, word people makes all the difference.
Exception.
You know, how we understand everything what society does, including the films they make.
Yeah.
And these films, in a way, but I had some, something else to say about these films, because films are also not just the making of them, but also their opening up to a spectatorship. who sees them and how they see them, both in terms of the specific film, but also in terms of the general culture of seeing films. If you look at that history from the 60s to now, and I can speak in my own voice here, when I consciously kind of got into film seeing in a passionate and serious way, Indian and non-Indian, international, from mid-70s little bit, but 80s onwards up to early 2000s. Then with my eyes, it became more and more difficult. I could think of seeing films that our kind of generation as not really based on a genre classification. We would see films based on authorial identity, so great filmmakers, Godard, Hrithik Ghatak, Satyajit Ray, whoever you have in mind, and then a kind of rough sense of the films they are making in relation to the context in which they are making it, but not according to genre identity. So we wouldn't see a film because already it is positioned as, say, a horror film, even if it's a serious horror genre, or even in terms of, let's say, an animation. There would be animation in some Godard films very early on, but we wouldn't think of these as the decisive spectatorial, the ones which spectators were really guided by. We were guided by authors, filmmakers, and the context, the story. So, Fanny and Alexander is made by Ingmar Bergman in his old age, rather than the ones he made in his youth. That distinction we would make. Today, there is, in that sense, we would make epistemic distinctions within films. Today, there is a strong epistemic culture of cinema classification. That you, before seeing the film, you know the film in terms of its traits, characteristics, principles of organization, in a very, like all epistemology does, in an objective way. A kind of pre-knowledge guides you. And that is, of course, also useful for marketing. Now my question would be, how would these films fit into that picture? Of an epistemological seeing, not in a rarefied sense, but in a wider sense, a kind of popular knowledge. Would we think of these films as, avant-garde films, niche films, even broadly political films? Or would we see them through national identity, like Palestinian films in that identitarian sense? Would we see these films according to the event, films made with the Gaza event? I don't know, but it's a question I'd like to keep open, because it's a very interesting question, because it opens up a film to the real of another kind, the real of cinema, any art, of the spectator, because that by definition can be anybody. You see, you can make a film according to certain choices and restrictions given to you. Because you're in Palestine, you can't go out, you want to make a film, you kind of work on your desire and make the film you are able to make. But once the film is made, you can't say, and you don't want to say actually, that this film is for. We are seeing it, someone else is seeing it, or maybe no one is seeing it, no other land, such a famous film now, within that epistemic circle, but because its Palestinian identity is a taboo identity, can't get a proper, wide release in the US. Yeah? So to me, that would be a very interesting question, that these films that we saw over the last 2 days, not sociologically merely, but in terms of real. Who is that real spectator to which these films really, in a sense, create the thread, that distance is kind of, joined by a thread, which we cannot calculate. That to me is a question I'd like to keep open. That's it. I'm not going to say another word.
But I had a question, sir.
break my pledge for your sake.
Very sorry about that. But since yesterday I've been thinking, and you briefly touched upon it right now, through the difference between Natpa and apocalypse.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, um, uh, so my question is how we need to differentiate between, how do we differentiate today between the difference that the 20th century teaches us within humanism and anti-humanism? How do we give a meaningful understanding of what we mean by exception, and to sort of demarcate between what we understand as exception, which is an exceptional act in terms of towards a larger good, whatever, and an exception which a certain regime points out as an anomaly, something that will be destroyed. So could you please
Now, again, let me answer this in the broader context. You're right to point out that that sort of strong and robust political choice made between humanism and a kind of new affirmative anti-humanism, which is very different from a kind of debasing of the human into something simply inhuman in the ordinary sense. That robust sort of dramaturgy of choices we do not have. We do not have. That change has happened, and it is connected to all the discussions we've been having about this. About, on the one hand, this strong mass potentiality which keeps getting enacted literally on the streets. Yeah, and you reminded us of Nepal recently. So it's happening today. But what is its kind of what is its subjective figure mostly these days? And it's not just Nepal, Bangladesh, Kenya, in Africa, but relatively weak states. The subjective figure is Gen Z, right?
Yeah.
Which from the 60s could be imagined as kind of broadly youth. But Gen Z is even more specific, because Gen Z is not just an age bracket, it's also a kind of culture, which is internet savvy, connected, networked, and so on and so forth. Now, on the one hand, this would look like a certain kind of, again, epistemic, you have a pre-knowledge. No, it's like saying we are the ones who see horror films. In the same way Gen Z does politics. Now, obviously, that would be a kind of epistemic enclosure of something that is far wider than that. Because what Gen Z is doing is not about just doing one thing. It is about something fundamental. Yeah. So, to that extent, I think there is a kind of wager on an act which is quite radical, and it keeps taking place across the world. In a country like India, it might not still take place in a very frontal sort of against or vis-a-vis the body of the state, but it does take place in relatively marginal but significant corners, like recently something took place in Ladakh. Yeah, so that is happening, but at the same time, it is true that compared to the intensity of the so-called act, and this is something we have been saying again and again, its objective form is relatively mainstream and conventional and institutional. And in that sense, part of the humanitarian ideology or humanist ground, which is more or less governed by a paradigm of liberalism or even neoliberalism. But the very fact that we have so many responses to this very thing in terms of, frontal militant mass assaults on the neoliberal order or the global order in different parts of the world means that it is in some kind of a crisis and decline, this, so to speak, liberal humanitarian order. But we definitely do not posit the other kind of structural option of a robust anti-humanism anymore. That is true. That is true. Even though we have specific regimes of fascination with, say, a kind of technoculture, which could contribute to an anti-humanism. But it doesn't come together as a political alternative in the way it was not realized, but at least envisaged in the 60s and 70s. You know? So there is and this is a kind of retreat, definitely a retreat. And Palestine is not outside of that. Just like Kenya is not, and Bangladesh is not, and Nepal is not. So we will have these acts which are extremely frontal and vivid, and they will dazzle us or horrify us depending on what is happening, which is exactly what happens every time something happens. They dazzle and horrify. But there will also be, in many a case, a quick retreat. That is not unusual these days. So we have to, now one of the responses to this is, Saleability's response has been that we must be careful about what he calls movementalism. We should definitely be alert to the potentiality of movement in the emancipatory sense, but we should be wary of being easily seduced by what he calls movementalism. Because movementalism can also be something which is a kind of fetishized sensation which can easily get submerged in a sort of liberal order. But that doesn't mean that we must go back into the conservative idea of, belonging to the norm. If you have, like Weber pointed out, a thought of politics, or you're trying to pursue a thought of politics. But this is a dilemma. Because a thought would mean not a program, but a strong principle. And a strong act without a sufficiently strong principle actually goes in the direction of something which is not anti-thought, but definitely what religion posited as a leap of thought into faith. A kind of, like Kierkegaard would very beautifully speak of non-thought. Non-thought requires extraordinary courage and produces extraordinary consequences. But non-thought itself is at the level of the act. While thought is something which can actually be recommenced, while non-thought cannot be recommenced. So Nakba, to that extent, for me, is still on the side of thought, which can be recommenced. While apocalypse, to me, is an ideology of non-thought, which easily degenerates into anti-thought. But I don't want to make dogmatic assertions, not too much. But it's a genuine dilemma. I cannot go beyond this, because then I would be making, giving opinions. That is not really what I want to do. But I would like to share with you my analysis or diagnosis of the problem. So yes, that much I'll say. Okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in another way, I think Sir has also written about it in his article, that it's important to keep the figure of counter-revolution alive for any thought of politics today. Otherwise, everything gets flattened and normalized and so on and so forth. So, in certain way, that I'm not saying Nakba is counter-revolution, but I'm saying counter-revolution, the verification part Sir talks about, counter-revolutionary verifications. I think that remains the minimal way through which one could kind of traverse through the time.
But with Palestine, what we're talking about is between the weak state, which the point you raised in the morning, the weaker state, the weakest state actually, and something which I tried to show as to be a delegated state. Yeah, not a state, but you know, a kind of imposition of a minor status to a whole people. So when a guarantor or a trustee comes, he's the only adult in the room. So even if the children are the children of kings, they're still children. So on paper we could say, well, Palestinians have the right to self-determination, but not yet. They can't exercise it. So Donald Trump is the only adult in the room, while Palestinians, the whole lot of them, and Palestine is of the status of the minor. This travesty, I think we need to seriously question and dismantle, because it is a travesty which is easily it persuades people that okay, come se come, the war is over. No, so let us treat them nicely, like we treat children, and take it from there. So Hamas, of course, it has its own interests in opposing what Trump has said and the security resolution. But at least the public argument makes sense. The public argument is we do not accept the principle of trusteeship, guarantors. Our principle is Palestinian people make their choice. Even within the finite idea of the state, at least be consistent on that level. The trouble is you can't do that. The moment you do that, you are in a circle, because if you do that and Palestinians, who knows, choose the very thing called Hamas, even if the name changes, then where do you go? So to avoid that, you bring in this minority strategy, minority/sovereignty strategy for Palestine. This needs to be both demystified and dismantled at every level. And strangely, I think even these films are doing that. They're showing you these are adults, including the children. This time I'm not going to say anything more. This is the last bus. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess on that note we can bring the session and the workshop to a close. I think we have more questions in our minds as we depart from this place than answers, and hopefully that will give us more space and time to come. We can continue these conversations. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Vaibhav and Sir, and to all of you actually. In fact, when we were, Rakesh and I, Rakesh was the main person who kind of conceptualized this whole workshop. I was here for the administrative part. But yeah, I mean, for the longest time we have had these conversations, and it felt necessary to have a distance again and have these conversations, which is very intensive. So in its formulation, it was formulated in an intensive way to precisely address this, to maybe later shape the strategies of political organization, of activism and thought even. So yeah, I hope to continue this conversation with all of you. And in their absence, I really want to thank Vijay, who's a staff here, and Sameer particularly, who has helped us with the equipment and with the camera. Thankfully for their help, we have been able to record these sessions, and once the editing and all of that is done, we will circulate it to everyone. And again, in her absence, the head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor K. Gita, for giving us this space again. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think it was extraordinary that you were able to do this. We have not been able to do anything.